Of course, the events at the Bay of Pigs occur at a kind of a critical juncture in the whole development of the Vietnam engagement of the United States. As you point out throughout the book, the U.S. involvement in Indochina, what you refer to as a 30 Years' War, began in 1945. One of the things that was very striking to me was your description of a series of rather significant steps that were taken with U.S. involvement in Indochina, a large relocation of population, some rather significant measures that disrupted the traditional culture and economic infrastructure of the country. And what you more or less seem to be suggesting is that these blunders, these actions taken without a real appreciation of the culture of the area, had as much to do with creating the conditions of chaos and warfare in Vietnam as anything else. I'd like you to tell our listeners something about this, because again, it's a rather unique vantage point view of what actually went wrong in Vietnam.
I mentioned earlier that we had armed and equipped Ho Chi Minh, which would surprise a lot of people now, but that's how it happened. And then we broke away from that and began to arm the French until the French were defeated at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. In 1954, there was an agreement in Geneva that the country would be separated at the 17th parallel into North Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh and South Vietnam under a question mark for a little while, Bao Dai, the old king. But very shortly, under Ngo Dinh Diem, an exile Vietnamese brought in there by the United States and made president of Vietnam about June or July of 54. But of equal importance, in January and February of 1954, the subject of what to do in Vietnam had come up several times. And people should be familiar with the fact, and I very carefully cite this from records, that Eisenhower, in speaking to the National Security Council, said he would never, he bitterly opposed, the words he used, to the introduction of American troops into Vietnam. He would never approve that. In less than a month from that meeting, the Dulles brothers and others, Secretary of Defense and some others, were meeting on what was called the Vietnam Committee of the National Security Council. And they approved an idea that Mr. Allen Dulles came up with, the Director of Central Intelligence, to introduce just 5 men into Vietnam as more or less special advisors with the support forces there that were there to aid this, get the country started. You know, as a country that had no existence, it had to get started. And he called that unit the Saigon Military Mission, put it under the control of Colonel Lansdale in the Philippines and other men. One of the first things they did was to use the paragraph in the Geneva Agreements that, in all fairness, it appeared, said, any North Vietnamese who would rather be in the South is free to go, and any South Vietnamese who would rather be in the North is free to go. What the Saigon Military Mission did was go into North Vietnam, and through all kinds of acts, terrorism, propaganda, frightening the people and everything else, they managed unbelievably to cause 1,100,000 of those North Vietnamese to move to South Vietnam. Now, it wasn't all done quite that simple. The U.S. Navy transports carried 660,000 on U.S. Navy vessels. In my book, I have photographs of the operation, just so people will know what really took place. CIA's aircraft, the Civil Air Transport Airline, which is a proprietary airline, CIA, carried between 300,000 and 400,000. Now, there's only one port in South Vietnam. That's at Saigon. So they have to go down the coast and up the river to Saigon and then turn these 1 million people loose. Now, can you just picture what would happen if 1 million people from New York were all of a sudden taken to Kansas City and just dumped loose? No money, no home, no food, no automobile, no TV, no nothing. You know, what are you going to do with them? Well, that's what happened in Vietnam. These people became rioters. They were, trying to get food. They didn't have drinking water. You can be up to your knees all day in a rice paddy, but you can't drink that water, and so on. A terrible situation came up, such that you'll remember the days when the fighting in Vietnam took place south of Saigon, not up in the north. If the Canadians were going to fight this country, would we expect the war to take place in Florida? Well, that's what was going on. This was a make-war deal, going back to the Malthusian theory that, well, these poor folks aren't going to make it anyway, so if we kill off that million or 1.5 million or 4 million, as was more likely the number, you know, so what? And that kind of thinking took place in that country. And the wartime fodder, the people that get shot at and chased around, to a great degree, were these million. Now, in the million, there were many fifth columnists put there very alertly by Ho Chi Minh and his forces. That exacerbated the problem. So when Vietnam came into being with that kind of a problem, and what do you do when you create a country today and you expect it to defend itself tomorrow? No army, no police, no tax system. You know, you don't create a country in a day. And this was another problem, and we never really recognized it properly. Eisenhower himself in '54 said we should let the Vietnamese fight their own war. Well, it's a nice thing to think about, but they had no means of fighting the war. And the other man, armed to the teeth with weapons that we had brought to Vietnam, it was crawling all over him, you see. We don't really understand the background history of the Vietnam War. All we remember is that Marines invaded Vietnam in 1965, and we had 550,000 American soldiers there by 1969 or so. Well, sure, that was a big war then, but when it's those first 20 years were what I'm talking about. And another thing is, all of that first 20 years was when the leading operating commanders were all CIA people carrying on clandestine warfare as they had been ordered to do. They didn't invent it, they were ordered to do it, which changes Vietnam history a little bit.
So you're basically saying, I gather, that some of the activity in the South that was being generally transmitted back to the United States on the 6 o'clock news as communist insurgency, Viet Cong operations, and the rest was a consequence of a chaotic situation, banditry, and these kinds of things brought about by starvation and the policy of this mass migration of this million or so people down from the north.
Read today's paper, read tomorrow's paper. What's going on in Yugoslavia? What makes people fight in the streets in situations like that, and particularly in Vietnam and back in *54 and '55, is hunger. I mean, they had nothing. You dump these people, 1 million people, loose in a place. You know, Vietnam is probably as old a part of the world, has a history as old as any part of the world. It is an ancestral ground type society. They never leave the ground where their ancestors were. The place where the ancestors' bones are buried is sacred to them. They don't jump in a nearest Honda and drive off to the nearest McDonald's. They stay right where they live. Okay. And to already pick up 1 million of them and move them down to the south and just turn them loose, why, that created a war. And if you remember the geography of the war, when this very famous man, John Paul Vann, had been made general, he wasn't a military general, he was sort of made a general by the civilians, and not CIA, it was an aid program, I think. Where did they put him to fight? South of Saigon, you see? And there's where the war, and then as the war went and it bloomed up into a major debacle. For instance, do you realize we lost over 5,000 helicopters in Vietnam? Over 1/3 of the men who died in Vietnam died in helicopter crashes, helicopter operations, even just in helicopters crashing by themselves. Over 1/3 of the men are attributed to helicopters. That's an expensive business.
I think you said that the cost of the Vietnam War, just in terms of military hardware, somewhere in the book, was about $230 or $240 billion. On this Vietnam question, was Kennedy actually about to cancel the plans to move U.S. military forces in a large-scale way into Vietnam? Was this an important aspect of why Kennedy was assassinated?
Again, as I've said earlier, Jeff, you can't write history with hindsight. So your word cancel, I would cancel also, because in 1960, just to give you a good example, Time magazine mentioned Vietnam 6 times. That's how important it was. They mentioned football more than that. By 1962, there were about 15,000 to 16,000 men in Vietnam, and many of them were the helicopter maintenance people for all these helicopters that were out there that where CIA was operating, and other logistics people. So that by the end of 1962, the general who was out there, Harkins, asked for more troops. He said, I got people here, it's 15, 16,000, but I don't have any combat people. And General Wheeler, the director of the Joint Staff at that time, and the man that brought me down to the JCS and set up my office there, had a report made of that, and they found out that less than 1,600 men were really combat experienced, and they were training this new Vietnamese army. And that was what Kennedy had when he was making the studies about Vietnam. So there were no orders to build up. It was a question of whether in the future he would do that. So during 63, beginning, we'll say, in August, my own boss, General Krulak, the Marine general, was in the Pentagon at least 30 different, in the White House, excuse me, at least 30 times at meetings with Rusk and McNamara and other leaders deciding on the policy of Vietnam, all under the close eye of Kennedy. Now, this is all in a wonderful book that the government has published on the Foreign Relations of the United States, a recent volume that goes from just August 63 to December 63, published in 1991, and it explains Vietnam better than anything's ever been written. And when it finally came time for Kennedy to issue orders about Vietnam, he took a report that was written by McNamara and Taylor, Chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Secretary of Defense, and accepted their report, which meant that the Vietnamese now, by 1963, could stand on their own feet, provided we gave them money and weapons and so on, but we didn't need troops. And in that report, NSAM 263, it said we'll take home 1,000 men by Christmas and all U.S. personnel out of Vietnam by 1965. You may have seen the picture in my book. I took the front page of the Army's own newspaper, Stars and Stripes, and showed that banner across the top. People that say there was nothing in history that would prove that Kennedy was saying that ought to read just that paper itself. Other papers, of course, said the same thing. Kennedy was taking American personnel, it didn't say military, all American personnel out of Vietnam by 65. That was his key plan. He was going to run for president again in 64. He knew he would win, and in 65 he'd have. He was not going to bring Americans into Vietnam, and that's one of the key things that we made as a point of Oliver Stone's movie JFK. We said Kennedy was not going to put Americans in Vietnam.
Let me actually